Good afternoon, New Life Church. Welcome to the month of November. Welcome to our TRAC Devo for the week. And welcome to a new book as we have begun the book of Matthew. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed jumping into this gospel. And here are a couple of nuggets that I took away from our reading this past week. The first one is this. As I started the book of Matthew, right away he starts off with the genealogy of Jesus. He starts writing, "This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham." Abraham was the father of Isaac. And then he continues verse after verse after verse until he comes to where Jesus is born. And I thought, what an interesting way to start a book, starting with the genealogy. And then I thought, wait a minute, how cool is this? That Matthew tied in the Old Testament with the New Testament. Because where does Matthew start? He starts all the way back in the book of Genesis. He starts with Abraham, the very one that God had given the promise to. How awesome is that Matthew shows us how the Old Testament and the New Testament are connected, how it's one story of God's plan. And Matthew continues with that reference to the Old Testament when he also writes in chapter 1, "Look, the virgin shall conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. Here he's quoting from one of the prophets in the Old Testament. So Matthew takes his time to let us know that what happened in the Old Testament is a continuation of what is happening in the New Testament, that it's all one big story. And folks, we're so good at breaking down the Bible into Old Testament, New Testament, books of the Bible, that we forget that it's one story of God's love, of God's plan of redemption, of how Genesis is tied into everything that happens all the way up until Revelation, how this is a book from beginning to end of God's love for mankind. So right away, Matthew ties in Old Testament, New Testament. This is all one big story, folks. As you're reading the Bible, this is one story of God's redemptive plan. Well, that's nugget number one. Nugget number two is this. As I was reading through the genealogy, there were names that I could easily read and pronounce, but then there were some names that were just really tough to figure out how to pronounce. But as I was reading through them, there were so many different individual stories. If I was to look at each individual person, each one of them had a story to tell of what happened in their life. There was both men and women. But the cool thing is this, how God took all of these individual stories and they were all woven together into his plan. How each one of them had a specific purpose in a specific time for a specific reason. And God wove all of that together to bring about what he had planned. And folks, what I took from that was this, that God has a plan for each one of us. I may not understand how it weaves into everything else. I may not understand how it's all going to work together. But as I read this in the different genealogy, in the genealogy of Jesus, and I read all these different names, each one of them was significant to what God had planned. Folks, you are significant to what God has planned. And then I took it a step further and I thought, Jesus called Matthew. A lot of people did not like Matthew. He was a tax collector. In that day, they were known as someone who cheated people. And yet Jesus took the very story of Matthew's life and he called him. And he had him one of his disciples and he wrote the Gospel of Matthew. How cool is it that God takes our lives when we yield to him and he fulfills the plan and the purpose that he has? We may not understand it. We may not get it. We may not know the full extent of it. These people in the genealogy of Christ, I have a feeling they did not know that they would be recorded in Matthew chapter 1. And yet here we find their names. You don't know how your name's going to be recorded. You don't know how God's going to fulfill his plan and purpose through your life. But let me tell you something. God is fulfilling what he had planned for you as you yield to him and as you give everything to him. Folks, it's exciting to be used by God. It's exciting to know that we are part of his plan. So what are the two nuggets I took away? One is, I think it's so cool that Matthew ties in Old Testament, New Testament right away. Also, I think it's really cool that he lists all of these people, imperfect people, all who had different experiences in their lives, and yet God wove it all together to fulfill his plan. We all have different experiences in our life, and yet God weaves things together to fulfill his plan and his purpose. Hey, New Life Church, know that we love you, we care about you, we are here for you, so if you ever need us, please feel free to give us a call at the church office. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye.